today's lecture of information security. We are in another location today, so greetings from Bavaria. And today we are going to talk about physical side channel and fault attacks. And let me just attach this microphone first so that the sound is actually better. Okay. So what we cover today are physical side channels, and before we do that, I would like to go through a quiz with you that is about the last lecture that you should have seen by now as a recording. So let me just start that quiz first, and for that I will hide the slides for a second so that so that we can start the Menti quiz. And also I have to use a bit of a different setup today, so I can't check these questions and answers on my phone, so I have to do that on the computer as well. Yes. Now I can also see the questions in the Q&A. Internet seems to work. Yes, the internet seems to work. That's true. Then there is a second question, and that is how can I flush the cache? How can I check the access time for a specific cache entry if it's the other process's data? Should I not have access? Do I? Well, if it's shared memory, then you can flush things from the cache. And if you use some instruction to measure the time, for instance, RDTSC, then you can also measure how long it takes to access a memory location. So let's start the quiz. So I go to this tab here. And we start with the first question, so make sure that you join the quiz now. There's still a lot of people joining, so let's just wait a few more seconds here, but make sure that you join in time. And then when I start the quiz, please check your phone, because on the phone you will see earlier when the stream starts. So when the quiz starts, then in the stream. So the stream always has some delay, not too much. If you press the live button down there, then you should be all live. And during the quiz is also a good point in time where you can click this live button, because there's not much what you can miss during the quiz, because you get all the prompts also on your phone. Okay, so we have a few participants in there, and I would say let's start the quiz. Answer fast to get more points. A side channel, and that's the first question. A side channel leaks data not through the main channel, obtains metadata and derives data from it, or is unintentional leakage. And time is almost over. Yes, and most of you got it right. So that's the definition that we use for a side channel. Unintentional leakage is difficult because what if I say, well, I don't care about the leakage, it's intentional, does it then not, is it then not a side channel anymore? So that's difficult. So it might change based on my view on whether the data leakage is critical or not, whether it is a side channel or not. And that's a bit weird if we want to use it as a technical term. Leaks data through not the main channel. If you think about it, network packet analysis to infer what website you visited. That's clearly data through the main channel. The network packets, you observe the size, you derive what website was visited. So there the data leaks through the main channel, and that is the network packets that are sent over. Okay, also main channel, very difficult to argue what is the main channel of an operating system. So side channel attacks on operating systems exist, but what is the legitimate main channel there? So let's continue with the next question, question number 2. And here we want to talk about the string compare example from last time. Using string compare for a password check introduces a side channel because of timing differences caused by the function logic, the L3 cache, or the operating system. And only one of these answers here is considered correct. As always in Menti quizzes, Menti only understands if there's one correct answer, so it never makes sense to click multiple of those. The function logic. The function logic is the problem here, because in one case you're executing maybe more code or different code than in the other case. The L3 cache, probably not. So maybe in some cases it might have some influence, but yeah, it was not a classical timing side channel on the cache here. Okay, let's continue with the next question, and that's question number 3. And we will now talk a bit about Meltdown and Spectre. Meltdown and Spectre are main channel attacks, side channel attacks, translucent execution attacks, speculative execution attacks, or transient execution attacks. That's tricky. Yeah, so as discussed in the last lecture, we call them transient execution attacks. They are not side channel attacks. If you missed that part, just watch the lecture from last time again. They are not side channel attacks because they are not inferring any information from metadata. They are directly obtaining the data. So Meltdown, for instance, accesses a kernel address. It gets the data from this kernel address directly. It reads this value from the kernel address. And that's the problem. So there's no metadata involved here. There's no correlation between some metadata and the kernel data. We literally read the kernel address. In a user program, you would just write, here's a character pointer, I assign a kernel address to it, and then I dereference it. That's Meltdown. That's not a side channel. Speculative execution attacks for Spectre, yes, but for Meltdown, no. In Meltdown, we don't have any speculative execution involved. Translucent execution attacks were a decoy, and then transient execution attacks, of course, the correct answer. Okay, let's check the next question. Maybe we want to talk a bit more about Meltdown, and maybe that's also necessary, and then afterwards about Spectre. So first, Meltdown. Exploits misspeculation after a branch misprediction, or dereferences an address from other user programs, or dereferences a kernel address. I might have given the answer away already, so that's of course bad. But let's see. Yeah, okay, so the majority got it right, but misspeculation after branch misprediction, no, that's not what Meltdown does. Meltdown has nothing to do with branch prediction or branch misprediction or speculative execution. Meltdown just dereferences a kernel address. Done. That's the entire thing, what the attack does. Dereferences an address from other user programs? No, that's not possible. If you think about what you learn in operating systems, you are in a virtual address space. how would you dereference an address from another user program? You have no way to express that. You can write down a kernel virtual address and dereference that, and your program will get a segfault, yes, but before that you have the meltdown effect that gets you the data from the kernel address. So this is wrong. This one doesn't make any sense. This one is correct. So let's continue. Question 5 out of 6. So we still have 2 more questions. Spectre. Dereferences addresses from other processes, dereferences kernel addresses, makes the victim misspeculate or makes the attacker misspeculate. So you already see in Spectre there's an attacker and a victim. That's the difference against to Meltdown, where, well, you could say the kernel is the victim, but the kernel doesn't do anything. The kernel doesn't have to actively compute anything. In Spectre, a victim has to actively do something so that you get the data. And the victim would misspeculate and access certain memory locations. And from that, you get the information out of the transient execution. Dereference addresses from other processes, no, that's definitely not the case, because it's technically not possible. You cannot dereference addresses from other processes. They are not in your address space. Every process has its own address space. Dereferences kernel addresses would be possible, but that's the meltdown effect. We just talked about that before. So that's the meltdown effect. And yeah, we're not talking about the meltdown effect here. Makes the attacker misspeculate. What would we gain from that? We could do that, but what would we learn? We could maybe time how long the misspeculation takes or where the misspeculation goes. And by that, we could learn how the branch predictor was trained. And that is what we call branch prediction side channel attacks. But it doesn't leak you the data. It just tells you metadata about what happened in the past. So that would be the side channel. But if you turn it around, it becomes Spectre leaking the actual data. And then finally, a covert channel. We had a definition for covert channels in the last lecture. So we want to also think about that. A covert channel is a side channel where the attacker controls both ends. A side channel is where the attacker controls no ends. A side channel that only leaks in is a side channel where the attacker controls no ends, or is a side channel that only leaks encrypted data. So either both ends, no ends, or leaks encrypted data. Yes, so no ends doesn't make any sense. If the attacker doesn't control any ends, then the attacker cannot really do anything. Is a side channel that only leaks encrypted data. What use would it be? And that's also not what we call a covert channel. A covert channel is a side channel where the attacker controls both ends. For instance, they are in isolated virtual machines that are not allowed to communicate with each other, but they can communicate with each other through a side channel. And that's what we call a covert channel. And with that, we are already done with the quiz, and we have a leaderboard, and we want to see who got the most points. We have in first place Mike with 4,794 points. Congratulations, Mike. Oh. That's a lot of applause here. And then, of course, on second place, Nana, and then Gubu. So congratulations there as well. So with that, I would say we are done with the quiz, and we can continue with the slides. I have a lot of slides, and I also have some videos to start with. So a side channel. You all know side channels already. I mean, not just from the last lecture, but also from maybe the movies. So you probably have seen that in TV somewhere, or in some movies somewhere, where they try to crack a safe open, and the safe internally, if it's such a safe with a wheel, has these latches, and they snap in if you are at the right number and turn it the other direction, and that makes some noise. And with a stethoscope, as you see here in this demonstration, you can hear when the latch snaps in, and then you can infer exactly what the correct number positions are and when you have to turn the wheel the other direction. So, side channels. You know them from movies. You also know them from the real world. And side channels, I have an example here for side channels. Again, a short sequence from a documentary that I want to share with you. Because side channels, we know them from our everyday lives. We observe meta information and infer information from it probabilistically. It's not always correct what we infer, but with a good probability, it is correct. Not always, but with a good probability, the inference makes sense. So let's just watch this short sequence from the documentary.
Nonverbals are anything that communicates but is not a word. The public knows them as body language. How we dress, how we walk, have meaning, and we use that to interpret what's in the mind of the person. We had information from another country saying, you have an American we think is actually a mole. Fortuitously, he was videographed coming out of a flower shop. We're looking at the video, and everybody in our small unit, we were saying, well, there's not much there. You know, he's coming out of the shop, getting in his car. And I said, stop the film right there. Just as he came out of the shop, he took the flowers, and most Americans tend to hold the flowers by the stalk so that the flowers are up. This individual took them and grabbed the stalk and then held the flowers so that they were facing down. And I said, that's how they carry flowers in Eastern Europe.
Okay, so you see that this is a side channel, right? So before I continue with this example, let's discuss this side channel a bit. So the argument here is that the way you hold the flowers, whether they are facing upwards or downwards, gives away which country you are from. And of course, this is sort of a, let's say, maybe even a prejudice, how people hold flowers, right, in different countries. It's certainly not always true. But the question is, does it give you, if you would have to make a guess, which guess would you make to get a better chance at being right? And that's what side channels are about. It's basically trying to make the most probable guess and using that and trying to maximize this probability. There are very bad side channels and side channels that work very well, where the probability is very high. For instance, the flush and reload side channel, this is super accurate. That's like 99.99 something % of the times when you run this side channel, you get the correct information out. But the information from other side channels might be much more difficult to extract. And the inference step, therefore, then has a lower probability. Take lie detectors, for instance. I guess that most of you don't believe that lie detectors really work with a very high probability, right? Most of you would be like, maybe sometimes, but probably you can trick them. Think about it. Would you be able to trick a lie detector? Now, a lie detector is essentially side channel analysis on humans. So what we do is we attach these wires to a human and then measure things like whether the pulse of the person, the heartbeat, and if it is accelerated, for instance, you would infer that the person is lying. This is, of course, a very simple metric, a very simple metadata to data correlation that doesn't always work. Maybe the person's heartbeat speeds up for other reasons, or maybe the person is very good at hiding the lie and the heartbeat stays completely constant. So it's a side channel, but maybe not a very strong one. Still, it's widely, it has been widely used. It was very popular, and I think somewhere it might still be used today. So let's talk about other side channels. If we talk about the physical world, the side channels on our computers. This is a small computer, right? It's a small chip in this card. And on this one, we have physical access. Last lecture, we talked only about attacks without physical access. Today, we will talk more about attacks with physical access. And I see there's a comment in the chat. I have to see. Maybe I can make this a bit larger because it's really difficult for me to read. That's a bit too large. Let me just transform this a bit, then I will be able to see. Okay. Okay, so this is better, but I still don't see all of it. So the chat says the problem with the lie detector is the interpretation. Yes, that's absolutely correct. The lie detector, I mean, you don't know whether higher heartbeat rate means that the person is lying. You don't know it for sure. So if the attacker can execute code, that's basically the threat model that we are facing here in the physical world, then they have already won. So very different from the software world where we say, well, the attacker, of course, can execute code. In the physical world, I mean, we have these smart cards everywhere. We use them, for instance, for public transport as well. If you've been to London, for instance, or also other cities across the planet, they very often use those smart cards for public transport. I think in Graz, this is less common because there's no check-in system at the public transport stations. So we don't have it there. But of course, you are paying probably with these cards maybe a few times per week at some counter. And every time you do that, there is some computation going on these devices, right? Because they have to tell the shop where you're buying something that, yeah, this is a legitimate transaction. And the shop has to tell that to the bank that, yeah, the card confirmed that this is a legitimate transaction. So what do we do in these physical side channel attacks? The general model how this works is we have some attacker, we have some device, the attacker can communicate with the device and the attacker can manipulate the device actively or passively, for instance, by reconfiguring it, by increasing the environment temperature that would be active, by trying to change its operating conditions such as the voltage, removing the voltage for a split second, things that could bring the device into a weird situation. So the attacker can actively manipulate the device, but the attacker can also communicate with the device and then try to convince the device of doing something, and then observing how the device reacts. For instance, the attacker could trigger a signature process on a device that computes a cryptographic signature, and then observe that there was a cryptographic signature being computed on the device. And maybe if it is not constant time, or if there are some weird spikes like we saw in the software world, then maybe if this also exists in the hardware world, we can observe that and infer the key. This is already quite old, so this goes back at least to 1943. So there's a paper that was released by the NSA a few years ago, and there they had this story that at Bell Telephone Company back in 1943, they were working with these teletype systems where they would type something and send this through maybe through wires somewhere else, and there it would be sent to a printer so that someone can read it to allow to communicate over distances. And they saw that when you do that, you would see spikes on an oscilloscope that was placed in the same room. And then they tried this and analyzed this. This even worked if the oscilloscope was placed in a neighboring building. So this is highly problematic. So if you can observe whenever a key is pressed on the teletype system, that's metadata, and that allows you to infer maybe what was typed on this device. Okay, there's a question in the chat. I have to check what it is because I can't see it again. Oh no, no question in the chat. Okay, well then, let's continue. Yeah, physical attacks. Maybe we should categorize them into different categories based on the behavior of the attacker. There's a side channel attack where you passively observe the physical properties, and then if you actively manipulate the device to induce faults, to make the device misbehave, similar to the software exploits that we have seen in the first system security lecture here, where we made software misbehave, a fault attack also tries to bring the physical device into weird situations that shouldn't exist. For instance, by increasing the temperature outside of the operating range, or decreasing it outside of the operating range, or changing the voltage, exposing the device to radiation. There are plenty of things you can do with a physical device to manipulate its operation conditions. Yeah, and there's a question in Menti. That's why I was a bit confused now. So here it is. Maybe I can resize this window so that I can always see it. So there's a question in the Q&A asking, is the scheme to copy the bank cards at ATMs with an additional card reader also a physical sidechain attack? So there's this attack where you can copy bank cards by putting an additional card reader in front of an ATM, and you would just put that in front of the actual ATM, and if you push the card in, then you wouldn't notice that it's actually pulled through another card reader that is in front of the ATM. That's not a side channel because you just copy the data, right? If you would, for instance, take a microphone and listen to when the pin buttons are pressed, and then infer the pin from that, that would be a side channel attack. If you have a camera that directly records the pin pad. That also exists as an attack at ATMs. If you would have that, that's also not a side channel attack if you directly have recorded what the pin is. So a side channel attack always has the steps through metadata. Okay, the next question is what about the invasiveness? So if I manipulate the device, or if I let's say I observe how the device behaves, how do I do that? Do I have to open the device? So there are non-invasive physical side channel attacks where the device is not altered physically, we don't modify it. And there are also attacks where maybe they are semi-invasive, where I maybe open the device, maybe I depackage some chip, but I don't attach any electrical contacts to internal signals. But if you really talk about invasive physical attacks, then there's no limit. So just to give you an example, we have some illustrations. A non-invasive attack where the device is not modified, semi-invasive, where we decapped the chip and then maybe use an EM probe on this chip. And invasive, well, then basically it goes down to the gate level and you don't have any limit there. But it gets more complicated, of course. So let's get back to that side channel definition. Side channels are obtaining, or a side channel attack means obtaining metadata and deriving secrets from it. That's the basic idea of side channels. Any computation will influence physical properties, and that's metadata. For instance, the power consumption. And computations depend on secrets, the data. So we observe properties, metadata, power consumption, EM radiation, timing, to infer secrets. Well, that's the actual data, that's the bytes of the key, for instance. So just to give you more examples of side channel attacks, we have, for instance, these probes here, we have power consumption, we have some forms of radiation maybe, or acoustics, even it's a microphone setup. So timing, power consumption, EM emanation, sound, anything. And the set of properties that you can observe is basically unlimited. It just depends on what properties a device will influence. So if you would think about IoT devices today, then maybe you could also take temperature or even humidity into account for side channel attacks. Timing attacks on cryptographic implementations have been the most relevant in the past. The thing is that very often there are timing attacks in cryptographic implementations, or in the past were. Today it's, I think it's becoming less common in the standard crypto libraries. So for instance, OpenSSL, you don't find timing side channels in OpenSSL that often anymore. But as soon as you leave this main path of crypto that is well studied, then of course you often have this problem. But also OpenSSL has now this definition that some of these side channel attacks are just outside of the threat model. They say, we don't care about it, but I can leak your crypto keys. But they say, no, it's outside of the threat model. You're not allowed to do that, right? It's not in the threat model. But if I do that, I get your crypto key, and then I can steal your I don't know, cryptocurrency coins, or read your personal data, private data on your encrypted hard disk. It's out of the threat model. You're not allowed to do that. Or maybe there are bugs that also very often happens, and then the library will bug fix that. Sometimes even on certified devices, for instance, there was the Minerva attack and TPM fail attack. Those were certified devices, and they had timing attacks in their cryptographic implementations. The solution is, of course, to make everything constant time, and cryptographers know that already for a long time. That's why they always talk about constant time crypto. Well, constant time, that's actually quite difficult, right? And for instance, OpenSSL or also Mbed TLS, also a popular crypto library, they sometimes then say, well, constant time is too difficult, too expensive. Let's make it pseudo-constant time. So it's not really constant time, but most of the time you can't see a large timing difference. Most of the time, just very small timing differences. But then pseudo-constant time is also only pseudo-secure. So let's maybe continue with the CMOS circuits here. If you think about this, maybe you got them, you got some knowledge about them from CON. So CMOS stands for complementary metal oxide semiconductor, and it's used for today's digital circuits everywhere. It has very nice properties because you don't have a lot of problems with noise in there. So even if there's some electrical noise, it will still function correctly most of the time. And it has a very low power consumption. Only the switching of the CMOS circuit actually consumes power. But wait a second. Switching draws power, so if I change the value, this draws power. That brings us to power consumption. So different instructions or different data means that we have a different switching in these CMOS circuits. And that's great because we can just measure the power consumption during the operation. And with oscilloscopes today, we can have even gigasamples, like 10 to the 9 measurements per second of the power consumption. And this curve that we then have, what we have there, this is what we call a power trace. So what do we do to analyze this power trace? What's the first signal processing step if we want to figure out whether there's something leaking? We just look at it. Like we just, and like not like Kim, of course, but maybe like this. Here's the power trace, and here we can see an interesting pattern. Let's count that here. Where should we start to count? Here, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then this is different. What do we see here? 10. It's a power trace for a crypto algorithm. Which crypto algorithm is it? If you have a suspicion what it is, then just put it in the chat. Just write it in the chat and I will check whether you got it correct. A crypto algorithm that 10 times does something that looks very similar every time. This is the AES algorithm. The AES algorithm has actually 10 rounds. So the comment in Menti is ECB. Well, it doesn't really matter whether it's ECB or any other mode, but this is 10 rounds of an encryption algorithm. So let's maybe zoom in on a single round here. And then it looks like this. So we look at it closer. Okay, interesting. What do we see here? This looks different than this face. This face here looks different from this face. So it looks like we have something like 4 phases in there. So let's take a look at it. Do I not resolve that? Oh, okay. Maybe I don't. But you know that AES has like 4 different operations every round, right? So interesting to see. Operations and instructions, we can see them in the power traces. We can see patterns, like if something is repeated, or if there's a variation of a pattern, that's maybe loops or taken branches or repeated operations that we can see with these patterns. And with that, we can learn the control flow or even the instruction sequence that was executed. If we have some jumps in the power consumption profile, then maybe this is the memory access, especially for expensive memory types that consume a lot of power for memory accesses. But also accesses to peripherals that will be very expensive, because there you sometimes even have analog I/O, and then you need a lot of power to communicate with them. Can we exploit that? Of course. So let's do our first power analysis attack. So here we have something different. This is not 10 rounds of AES anymore. So let's take a look at what we have here. Okay, so if I look at this, then I see interesting things here. So maybe this one here, this pattern, if I go through the plot, I see it again here, right? So I see it here. I also see it here, right? This pattern where I'm focusing now on this region up here. This looks similar to this here, but it doesn't look similar to this one. But it looks similar to this one. Let me highlight them. So the ones that look similar, I marked them in red now. And the other ones, I marked in green. And that's a power trace of an RSA exponentiation, which consists of ones and zeros. If you think about it, RSA exponentiation is basically just an exponentiation modulo some number. And that's what we do. The modular exponentiation is done here bit by bit in the exponent. How do we get the key from that? Well, RSA decryption or also other operations with RSA will use this exponentiation, and if you use, the n is usually quite large, but also the exponent is usually quite large, usually a few thousand bits. So how can we do that efficiently? Because integers won't suffice there, right? Integers are not large enough for these things. So this is really, really large. But because we have here modulo n, we don't have to compute this actually huge number, but it will always be truncated. Just for the modular arithmetic that we are using here, if you compute a times b modulo n, that's the same as a modulo n times b modulo n. And then if you use the same logic with exponentiation, c to the power of a plus b modulo n is then c to the power of a modulo n times c to the power of b modulo n, and that modulo n. And then if we multiply them, of course, then this is a bit more tricky. So this is then c to the power of a modulo n to the power of b, because it's a multiplication there, modulo n. So we will take a look at this exponent d in binary, and we look at these bits like di is the ith bit of d, and d0 is then the least significant bit. So what we can do is, if we want to do this exponentiation, we can basically split this up. So this part is usually the part that Maria presents, and unfortunately that's of course not possible today. So this is basically just some explanation why the algorithm that I will show you next works. So what you can do is you can implement an algorithm that is called square and multiply. And with this square and multiply algorithm, you can go through the exponent bit by bit, and always do the exponentiation for that part, and then continue with the next bit, and then continue with the next bit. And that's basically what this algorithm looks like. So for all the exponent bits, from the most significant bit to the least significant bit, you go through it, and then you square the current value of m modulo n, or so this is what you always do. In the case the exponent bit is a 1, then you also additionally multiply it with c. So this is why we call this square and multiply. And it doesn't always multiply, it only does this multiply step if the exponent bit is a 1. So let's do an example of this here. D is 26, so 1, 1, 0, 1, 0. If we write this down, then we have 1 times c to the power of 2 times c for the next one. For the next one, that's a 0, right? So it's only squared. Then we have to the power of 2 times c for this bit here, and then again squared. So that's the square and multiply algorithm, why this works. On last slide, just as an background explanation, we're not too much interested in math behind it, we are interested in attacking this. And if you think about it, we go through the exponent and we either have square and multiply, or we only have square. Take a look at this plot again. This is a 0, is it? And this is the 1, or maybe vice versa. So the question is 0 faster or is 1 faster? I would suspect that the 0 case is faster because we have to do less. And that's also the truth here. So we see the key up here, and it's exactly the ones that have this pattern that looks a bit different and is also slower. There's a question on Menti asking, are there already usable tools to detect patterns in power traces, or do only humans evaluate the traces? There are tools for that. There are many pattern recognition tools, and also there's a long history of attacks in power side channel, in the power side channel area, and from the past 3 decades, almost 25 years maybe. And there are more powerful attacks than looking at them by hand, yes. For instance, template attacks are quite powerful. Okay, so what can we do against these attacks? We have to think about what we can do against them. Now I got it. And constant time, if cryptographers talk about that, they mean more than just constant time. Constant time is not just constant time. So what do they actually mean there? They mean no branching on secrets. The runtime must be constant, but the control flow as well. Everything has to be the same, always the same instruction sequence. The only difference that is allowed is different data. But the instruction sequence must always be the same. So you can't have any branches in your secret code, in the code that processes your secrets anymore. So you would switch to secure alternatives like constant time exponentiation algorithms, constant time modular reduction, and so on. Everything constant time. And with that, you have everything constant time and all the problems are solved, right? What about data differences? So here we have the power traces for a load instruction. We load a value from 0 to 255, different values from memory. And here we have the average power traces. Do you see any leakage here? Let's maybe zoom in a bit. So we look in there and we can see here in this region here oh, there are very clear patterns again, very clear patterns, and different intermediate values have a different power consumption. So there's a very clear correlation. So what you can do now is you can record and match these values, and that's the template attack. So the idea for a template attack is that you profile the power consumption for each possible value of this byte v, and then you record traces with all inputs known, and you group them together by v. So you generate a lot of traces, then group them by v. So you will have many traces for v equals 0, v equals 1, v equals 2 to the n. And that's what we call a profile or a template. And then what you do is you compare, you match the measured trace to all the templates and see which one fits best. And then you realize that maybe this one fits best. So you compute the probability, maybe an error function like mean squared error, and that's what we call a template attack. So template attacks, very powerful, because even if you don't really understand the traces, if you just record the traces for all the input values, then you can observe exactly which one fits best. And this often allows a key recovery with a single trace. Sometimes this is also the only option. If you only have a single trace, then you can only perform this type of attack. Or, well, not always. If the implementation is really broken, then you might be able to use a more simple attack, of course. An advantage, of course, is that this attack is very easy to mount, because you don't have to really understand that much about the underlying algorithm or the math behind it. If you just measure what was the input, what did the trace look like, and then match this together, then you can mount this attack rather easily. Negative point, you have to get these samples, right? You need to know when things are processed. You need to know from where to trace the process. So even if you don't have to understand full math behind it, you still have to know some things about the algorithm. So when is the process secret? The secret process, of course. What is the concrete algorithm that we use? Just to be able to set up an identical device, create a setup where you control all the inputs, and then you record that, and then you can recover these secrets from the trace. There's also more that you can do. For instance, here you see some kind of pattern, right? If you go from this intermediate value, like 0 starts up there, and then it goes down 64, it's down here maybe, or 64 is maybe up here again, 63, 64, okay, 128, and then we have, this goes 192 down to 256. So it looks like it's related to something that these numbers have in common. So what do these numbers have in common? Like 0, 64, 128, and 192. So we can model the power consumption, and we will do that now with the Hamming weight. The Hamming weight, here we have the power consumption. Well, the power consumption depends on switching, and if the Hamming weight expresses how many bits are set in some variable, then you switch from one value to another, that certainly gives you some information on the Hamming weight of the number that you processed. So what data was stored before we store a value there? Maybe a 0, but the new value, each one bit that we write there now draws power, and that gives us directly the Hamming weight, and that is exactly what we see here. So the Hamming weight, the more bits have to change, the more power is drawn here. So we can see that for 64, for instance, there's a single bit set, and then it goes down. And if we would just model that, let's just model this and say, well, we draw a line that expresses exactly the Hamming weight distance to 0. We get this line. Oh wow, so this is really close to the actual theoretical line for the Hamming weight. Okay, so many devices will have very similar power behavior because they work the same way. They are also using bits to store data, and therefore we can very often reuse these power models. For instance, the Hamming weight power model. An attack without detailed knowledge of a device or a concrete implementation might be possible with this type of attack, because now you know how this device might behave based on a model instead of the concrete implementation. So it gives you some advantage. You still need to know approximately what the device does, but maybe less knowledge is required. If we think about AES, so you should have already heard about that in the crypto lectures. So we have 4 steps in AES. We have the SBox lookup, sub-byte step, then shift rows, we have the mix columns, and then we have the add round key step at the end. So if we think about AES, we basically can also just XOR plain text, or that's the basic principle how it works. We XOR plain text and key together, we do the SBox lookup, and then we have some result from this SBox lookup, and this would be a single round, maybe the first round of AES here. So in this first round attack, if we want to attack this first round, we know that the round key, the key that we use for this round, is the actual key. In the other rounds, this is different. In the other rounds, we don't get the plain text in here and the key in here, but we get some intermediate value in here, and we get the round key in there. The key schedule on the other side is invertible, so we can compute backwards through this key schedule maybe. And this brings us to differential power analysis attacks. And I just give you very briefly 5 steps of differential power analysis attack, how they work. So the first thing that we do is we select an intermediate value that depends on a small number of key bits. Some subkey, maybe one of the bytes that are used somewhere in this encryption process. We then measure the power while querying the device, and then we try to do that with a lot of different values. Then we enumerate all the possible subkey values. That's if it's a byte, well, then we have 8 bits, so we have 2 to the 8 hypotheses. And for each plain text and ciphertext, we then predict what this intermediate value for this key would be. We will also then predict the power consumption for this intermediate. Will it be rather high or rather low, depending on how many bits are set, for instance with the Hamming weight power model. And then we compare the prediction that we have made with the measurement. Then we just pick the key hypothesis that fits best and statistically try to confirm that. And with that, we basically get the same as with a template attack, right? But this time the template is our model and not a template that we recorded. But then the statistical hypothesis test, if we compute what the correlation is, then the correct key hypothesis will have a very high correlation, whereas the others will have rather low correlations. Countermeasures against power analysis attacks. So what we can do is, if we have an unprotected setup, the cryptographic device processes something, we have some intermediate value, the intermediate value influences the power consumption, and that's bad because we can observe this step here. So there are two main techniques that we use to stop these attacks. The one is hiding, and there we say, well, we try to make sure that the power consumption is not related to the intermediate value anymore, or maybe it's buried in noise. So we add so much noise that you can't see it anymore. We add so much variation that this becomes invisible. The other option is masking, and there you make sure that the intermediate value does not give you information about the key anymore. So even if you observe this, you then have data that you can't really do anything with. And with that, we are done with the power side channel attacks. We will continue now with the fault attacks, which are more active. And in this case, we will actively manipulate the device. So the basic idea of a fault attack is to manipulate the device and change its behavior so that we, for instance, deactivate sensors, deactivate countermeasures. We skip the pin check. We can also, of course, fault implementations like crypto algorithms again. And then we compute the faulty and the correct ciphertexts, and this will maybe give us the key. So fault attack techniques, if you think about it, for instance, a chip, here we have again a decapped chip, and maybe we are shooting with some laser on the chip, and maybe this influences the computation. So we can have spike or glitch attacks based on the clock. So you can glitch the clock or the voltage. You can have a voltage spike or a very short voltage drop. Heat, radiation, laser, all of these are useful to induce faults into chips. And the typical effects are instructions are skipped, data is corrupted, anything like it. So think of a simple pin check, similar as the pin check that we had before, but this time we don't really care about the pin entry itself for now, but we care about what happens afterwards. We check whether the pin is correct, we read the pin, we check whether the pin is correct. If it is correct, then we open the door, otherwise we alert the police, and then we log this event. So if you think about it, this is very simple, right? Check condition, perform action, or handle error, and then continue. If we implement this, maybe it would look like this. So we compare whether the authentication was successful. If it is, then we go to this box here. Otherwise, we go to this box here and then to the log event. So what happens if we would skip one of these instructions? For instance, this one. Instruction skipping attack. This is a fault attack that we are performing here. A fault attack, I would say it's, to make this a concrete attack, we would have to think about whether we perform a voltage glitching attack or maybe shoot on the device with a laser, but that would be a concrete attack. This is more like an attack strategy, what you can do with a concrete attack that allows you to skip an instruction. So what we have here is we skip this instruction. What happens? Well, then we unconditionally go on to the authenticated block. So if we skip one instruction here, we can completely compromise the device. And you might know these from actually piracy examples already. Pay TV, for instance, in the early 2000s, there was Premiere, which was pretty much the predecessor of Sky that you still know today. And there the consumers, so the non-legitimate users of this pay TV network used pirated cards that were not legitimate, and the vendors actually were able to break these pirated cards via firmware updates. So they would insert an endless loop in the startup, and then the solution by the non-legitimate viewers of this pay TV network was to glitch to the escape loop. So you would buy an unlooper device for your smart card that you used for pay TV. But also in gaming devices, there was the Xbox 360 reset hack. We had voltage glitching there on the reset line, and then you could execute untrusted modified firmware. What we will look at is a fault attack on RSA. So RSA, we mentioned that earlier already. We had this exponentiation, and you can implement that very efficiently also if you use the Chinese remainder theorem. So you want to compute a signature this time, and n is a number. It's two prime numbers that are multiplied together, and these prime numbers here, they should be secret. So what you can do with the Chinese remainder theorem, you can compute the result modulo P and Q, if you know them, and then you can merge these results with the Chinese remainder theorem by multiplying these two parts together. And that's really nice because now you have two exponentiations, but with half the bit length and smaller exponents. So this speeds up things a lot. So what can we do here? If we perform a fault attack on RSA, in this example, we call this the Okay, it seems like we had some hiccup here. My computer decided that it is under a fault attack and just rebooted, something like that. And I'm just trying to get all the things back up running. Okay. So this was not the break. This was rather unintentional. Okay, I think we are back. And we are back to roughly where we stopped, right? Yes, fault attack on RSA. This sounds about right. Yes. And, oh, you can't see me. Wait, why can't you see me? Ah, yeah, I see. Okay. So, yes, I think now we should be back, actually. So let me start off here again. So I had some technical hiccups on my side. Not the internet was the problem, but actually my computer, who decided to reboot and lose half of its configuration for this streaming setup. But now it should be back up. And we continue right here where we left off. We had these two exponentiations with half the bit length and smaller exponents. We have basically, if we now think about an attack on this, the Bell core attack is that. Similarly, the Lenstra attack, an optimization of this attack, which works a bit differently, but we will just show you the Bellcore attack. It works pretty much the same. So here we have 2 times the same signature computation. And of course, there's a lot of formula symbols here. All the symbols like P and Q are the private key, right? The private key that no one should have. And then we have some signature parts, and we multiply things here, modulo P, and then we add that together. So if we fault one of these signature processes, we don't really need to know how all the math behind it works. So we just replace this now with something times Q plus some rest, and something else, something faulty, times Q plus some rest. So if I subtract now one from the other, I get some garbage times Q plus 0. And that's interesting. That's very interesting, because that means we have 2 numbers that were multiplied with Q, at least 2 numbers. So we have some garbage times Q, and we have P times Q. This is N, this is the modulus, which is also public. So we have 2 numbers that have as a greatest common divisor Q, so we can just run an algorithm to recover that. And here in this demo, we are actually doing that. So in this demo, we are attacking RSA. So this demo was created by Kit Murdoch, who was the first author on the Plunder Vault paper. And here we attack the RSA decryption operation, and we then undervault the system. Until we get there, we have some delay so that we are really sure that we are undervaulting correctly. So we will just wait a bit and do some random computations until then. So we have now undervaulted this with minus 239 millivolts. And of course, we can do this in software, but we could also do this in hardware. Undervaulting minus 240 millivolts, we see an RSA error, and then we run a Lenstra attack or Bellcore attack, and we see that it recovers from the faulty output and the correct output the secret key, and we can see here that the private key P that we have recovered here. And of course, then you can recover Q as well, because that's again just the greatest common divisor algorithm. And this, of course, is my undervaulting fault attack on RSA. We call this Mufasa. Okay, or maybe not. So maybe we can also do something more. You already know that in the end it was called Plunder Vault, but of course it's interesting to think about what could we name it. So fault attacks on AES. We also have AES, we have many rounds, so maybe we can fault ciphertexts there. Do we get anything from that? The ciphertext difference doesn't depend on the key, so no. What could we fault then? Maybe we can fault at one of the different steps here. Maybe we can fault, like this step is bad, maybe we can fault before this happens at round key, then we get the round key, right? But it depends on the faults. And it doesn't work with bit flips, because the fault will just propagate through the XOR that happens here, and then the ciphertext difference still would not depend on the key. We want to flip at a point where the key makes a difference. So maybe before shift rows, same as before, this just propagates through, and a bit error in one bit will be exactly the same in the output again. It's as if we faulted the ciphertext. Shift rows just rearranges the bytes. So maybe we go one step further up. One step further up, it depends on the faults. Are we able to flip a single bit? Then attacks will be possible. So let's try to do that. We do a single bit fault before the subbytes in the last round. So then we store all the correct and faulty ciphertexts, and we go through all the possible values for this key, all 256 values. And then we compute with ciphertext and the possible keys, the 256 possible keys, we compute back to this intermediate value before the S box. we can do that because we just do that for all 256 possibilities. Then we have the faulty ciphertext, and we do the same. But we know where we have to end up here. So we know the delta for delta. So we see here the delta that we get here based on our key assumption. And then we can check whether we see a 1-bit change here, or whether the change here corresponds to our 1-bit fault. And if that's the key, then we can, if that's the case, then we can recover the key. So let's go through an example just to illustrate that it's a bit easier to understand then. So we have the correct output, maybe 1A, and the faulty output is 99. Okay, so that doesn't sound like a single bit flip because a lot of bits changed here, right? But let's take a look. For instance, if the key byte, we then enumerate that, right, for this ciphertext and for this ciphertext. We compute what the input value was, what this intermediate value was, and then we can check for all the possible key bytes whether we find anything. So for instance, for 0, for 1, for 2, and so on. So we do that for all these possible key bytes. And then we see that, oh, for key byte 7, there's a single bit flip. Here's a single bit flip. And if we know that we induce single bit flips, we know that this cannot be the correct key because it has more than a single bit flip, and so on. Only this one has a single bit flip. And only very few keys have this property. And we can filter them. And if we just observe a few ciphertext, faulty ciphertext, correct ciphertext pairs, we get down to a single key. And if we got that, so we have this bit flip, a single bit flip here in this end of round 9, beginning of round 10. So after the add round key of round 9 and before the sub bytes of round 10. So what can we do there? So for each key guess, we test whether the partial decryption would produce a single bit flip here, and then in some cases, with 2 faulty encryptions, we can already recover the full key. And what we attack here is, of course, the state-of-the-art, the AES encryptions that you are all using all the time and that you are using right now because you're streaming something over the internet, and that's encrypted with AES, with these instructions. So there again, we use the recommended instructions and we encrypt a plain text 2 times, and then we check whether the result is the same, just to check whether it's faulty. And we run this inside SGX actually. So that's the enclave of Intel. And here we can see that we do this with some undervolting. We see some faults in 5th round. No, that's not the right round. Here, this is better already, 8th round. That's doable. We can compute from there through probabilistically to the end. And then we run this fault analysis, and there's a lot of keys left from these 2 faulty ciphertexts. We get a lot of key candidates, and only 1 key candidate is in both candidate lists. And we can see that here. It's exactly the key that was implemented in the code. And so we don't call this attack anymore Mufasa because it's more than just RSA. We call this attack Crypto Vault Screw Hammer because it attacks crypto in a vault, SGX. It's like a clock screw, which was also some frequency voltage manipulation attack. And it's a bit like Rowhammer maybe. And I don't know where to buy this tool here. It looks interesting. So maybe let's continue. So we can mount these attacks. So what do we do against them? We need to think about what we do against them. And there are different countermeasures that we can use. In the physical world, we can use countermeasures also of physical nature. So for instance, you can shield devices physically. For instance, this is an IBM hardware security module, and this has a lot of meshes, light sensors, temperature sensors, a lot of sensors to detect if something is wrong, if someone tries to open it. And this also has its own battery so that someone can't just remove the power. And if you try to manipulate it, it will immediately delete all the keying material on the device. You can't really get in there. And these meshes, they are really through this entire circuit. So you would really detect whether there's something manipulated. Power surge sensors, temperature sensors, light sensors, a lot of sensors. So this is against physical attackers. But sometimes you also can't do that, and also this is quite expensive. So what else can you do? Against faults maybe, also double execution. You can run the same thing twice and check whether you get the same result. And then maybe not just twice, but maybe 3 times. Then you can also make a decision. But if it's 2 times, you can still observe that something was wrong. And you can do this on different granularities, entire encryption for a single round, for each operation. So a lot of possibilities there. What if the attacker, there's one problem left, what if the attacker can fault both encryptions at the same time in the same round with the same fault? That's difficult, but it would be a remaining attack. Or maybe more sophisticated methods. Maybe the attacker uses statistical methods to see, well, I faulted it here it didn't fault, but I observed that the device did something different now, so I know that I induced a fault here, and maybe can infer something from that. So, physical attacks. Physical attacks, also follow the pattern of attack, defense, next defense, and so on. So we talked about different side channels here, and if you find a new side channel, a new attack, then this just is the next step of the game. And it's a never-ending cat and mouse game, and it has to be, because as soon as you stop playing this game as a defender, the attackers will come up with the next better attack. So we always have to run through this game, because there is no 100% secure, especially in the physical setting. The user controls the device. Any device can be broken by a determined attacker. So instead of saying, well, we make a device 100% secure, we can say we want to make the device so secure that attacking it is more expensive than the secret has value. So if you want to mount an attack and you have to invest $100,000 to break the device and get the secret, but the secret has a value of, let's say, 10 euros or 20 euros per month, because it's just the key for your smart card so that you can use a pirated card for watching pay TV, then maybe this is just not worth it. Or would you do an attack that costs millions to get a free tram ride? Yeah, probably not. And with that, we are already at the end, and I have one more slide here. So thanks Peter Pessl for some of the slides. So this was based on Peter Pessl's slide deck. That was, it's not, physical attacks is not necessarily my main topic, but let's check. We only have Q&A left for the end. Okay. So if there are any questions, just post them and then we will discuss them. Otherwise, we are already at the end of the lecture for today. And that says no questions from the audience. Well then, I would say if there are no questions, if you have any more questions, just ask them later on Discord, and this will also be fine. Okay. Have a nice day. Bye.